Tutankhamun. I mean, just the name itself conjures up these incredible images, right? Solid gold, ancient curses, unbelievable treasures. But for almost 100 years now, that famous golden mask has been hiding the real story. So we're going to look past all the glitter and the myths to uncover the scientific truth of a boy king who ruled a superpower, died when he was just a teenager, and somehow became this immortal legend. Let's unwrap the real story. You know, for over 3,000 years, he was just gone, lost to history, a minor pharaoh who was deliberately wiped from the records. Then, in 1922, an archaeologist named Howard Carter literally stumbles upon the steps to his tomb, the only nearly intact royal burial ever found. The discovery was a massive global sensation. It just lit this firestorm of fascination that created the legend we all know today.
So we all have that picture of King Tut in our heads, that breathtaking gold mask, all the dazzling artifacts, and, of course, those whispers of a deadly curse that supposedly followed anyone who dared to disturb his rest. But behind all that gold, there's this one central question. This is it. This is the enigma that has captivated the world for a century. How did a king, at the very height of his power, in the prime of his youth, just suddenly die? The theories have been all over the place, from a palace conspiracy to some kind of supernatural curse. But the real answer? It was locked away inside the mummy itself. For the longest time, speculation was really all we had to go on. But today, we've got tools that Howard Carter couldn't have even dreamed of. I'm talking about CT scanners that can do a virtual autopsy, and advanced DNA analysis that can read a genetic history that's 3,300 years old. Science is finally cracking this ancient cold case. And our investigation, it doesn't begin in his tomb. It begins in his very blood. The first, and maybe the most shocking clue to understanding Tutankhamun's life and his death is hiding inside his own DNA and the secrets of his royal family. See, to understand the man, we first have to understand the world he was born into. And for the royals of Egypt's 18th dynasty, family was, let's just say it was complicated. The key to his life and his death really lies in one pretty shocking common practice. Consanguinity. It's a fancy word for what we would call incest. Now, for the pharaohs, this wasn't taboo at all. It was a sacred duty. They believed they were literally descended from the gods, and to keep that divine bloodline pure, they married their siblings, and sometimes even their own daughters. It was a practice that would end up having absolutely devastating consequences. And here it is. This is definitive scientific proof. A huge, groundbreaking study back in 2010 analyzed the DNA from a bunch of royal mummies. They identified the mummy from tomb KV55 as the famous pharaoh Akhenaten, and the mummy known as the younger lady from KV35 as his sister. And the DNA proved, without a doubt, that they were Tutankhamun's parents. Just look at this, and you can see how extreme the situation really was. This genetic map, built from that DNA evidence, shows generations of inbreeding. This wasn't a one-off thing. Tutankhamun was the end result of a long, long royal tradition, and his body would have to bear the burden of this genetic inheritance. Okay, so this genetic history leads us directly to the evidence that was written all over Tutankhamun's own body. With modern tech, we can now basically perform a virtual autopsy, and what we see is a startlingly clear picture of the boy king, all based on decades of scientific study. For years, people looked at the strange, kind of elongated art style from his father's reign, and historians and doctors speculated that Tut must have suffered from all sorts of genetic disorders. These theories tried to explain why he was depicted with wide hips or an elongated skull. For a lot of people, this became the accepted truth. But were they right? Well, in a pretty stunning reversal, that same 2010 study that found his parents just swept away decades of speculation. The super detailed CT scans and the genetic analysis found zero evidence for Marfan syndrome, no signs of gynecomastia, no abnormal head shape from craniosynostosis. Science was separating the myths from the medical reality. But while those theories were wrong, the reality was just as grim, if not more so. Science confirmed he had a whole host of painful congenital conditions. He was born with a severe clubfoot, which forced him to walk with a cane. And get this, they found over 100 canes in his tomb. He had a cleft palate. He suffered from Kohler's disease, a rare and painful bone disorder that causes parts of the bone to literally die. And to top it all off, his DNA had markers for the deadliest form of malaria.
So we now have a very clear picture of the king. A frail young man, probably in constant pain, with a body just racked with genetic ailments and disease. And this brings us to the climax of our mystery. What was the final blow that ended his life at just 19? Let's start with the most sensational theory of all: murder. This is where the murder theory got its start. Back in 1968, the first ever X-rays of the mummy were taken. The lead radiologist saw what he was convinced was evidence of a fatal blow to the back of the head. He saw a bone fragment inside the skull and what looked like a depressed fracture. And just like that, the idea of a boy king murdered by his advisors was off and running. But then, a critical reappraisal of those X-rays, and especially the much more detailed CT scans we have now, completely dismantled that murder theory piece by piece. The so-called depressed fracture, just a normal thinning of the skull. Those bone fragments in his head, they were loose, which means they were dislodged after he died, most likely during Carter's original and kind of forceful autopsy back in 1925. And the supposed brain bleed? Nope, just solidified embalming resin poured in by the ancient morticians. So, the murder mystery that fueled documentaries and books for decades was all just a misinterpretation of the evidence. There was no foul play, which, of course, brings us right back to the central question: what did kill this frail young king? The scientific consensus now is that it wasn't one single thing, but a catastrophic cascade of events, a perfect storm. First, you have his weakened state. Then, the CT scans showed a badly broken left leg, a severe open fracture that happened right before he died. Maybe he fell from a chariot. And finally, his body was already fighting a severe case of malaria. Now, a healthy person might have survived that broken leg. A person without a broken leg might have survived the malaria. But for Tutankhamun, the combination was a death sentence. And so, after a really short and painful life, the boy king was laid to rest. But this is where the final incredible irony of his story begins. He was buried and systematically erased from history, only to be reborn 3,000 years later as the most famous pharaoh of all time. You see, Tut's father, Akhenaten, was seen as a religious heretic, and Tut's whole reign was about restoring the old gods. But his successors wanted to just erase that entire chaotic period. Horemheb, a general who became pharaoh, systematically removed the names of Akhenaten, Tutankhamun, and their successor A from all the official king lists and monuments. Buried in a surprisingly small tomb, Tut was completely forgotten. And that act of erasure, that is precisely why he's so famous today. It's crazy, because he was forgotten. His little tomb was overlooked by thousands of years of tomb robbers. So when Carter opened it in 1922, the world saw an ancient king's treasures for the very first time. It ignited a cultural phenomenon called Tutmania. Egyptian designs took over architecture, fashion, everything. And in the 1970s, his traveling exhibit became the first museum blockbuster, drawing millions. The forgotten king was now an immortal icon. It's really an incredible contrast when you put them side by side. In his first life, he's a physically challenged young ruler trying to heal a divided nation, only to be completely erased. In his second life, he's a symbol of unimaginable wealth and ancient mystery, a pop culture superstar whose fame is way bigger than even powerful pharaohs like Ramses the Great. And that brings us right back to the gold. As Egyptologist Robert Rittner explains, the gold wasn't just a display of wealth, it was theology. Gold was considered the skin of the gods. So by encasing Tutankhamun in all those nested golden coffins and that iconic mask, the Egyptians believed they were magically transforming him, giving him a new, indestructible, divine body for all of eternity. The very thing that mesmerizes us today was meant to make him a god. So what is Tutankhamun's true legacy? Is it the story of a frail boy king whose life was cut short by disease and injury? Or is it the story of an icon whose fame was ironically guaranteed by the very people who tried to make the world forget him? You know, maybe his real story wasn't the one he lived, but the one that began the exact moment his tomb was opened.